אז right.
Erev Tov. So, Ki Tisadrosh B'nai Yisrael, the parsha this week tells us about counting the Jewish people. From the fact that we're allowed to count, and from the way that the counting is done in the parsha, so there's an indication that generally speaking, this is not something that you should do. Counting Jewish people, counting directly is not recommended. The Gemara has a discussion whether there is one transgression or two transgressions if you go and count people. Very interesting question, which if we have time for at the end to get to. But when you have a census in this country, census in other countries, are you allowed to participate? Should you participate? How does that work? How does that square up with this question about counting people? A more practical on a smaller scale, we often have this when you're in a place, you need to know how many people you have for a minyan. You have to count, so we don't count directly, right? The custom is that we use a pasuk that has 10 words in it, and we use that, and that way we're not counting directly. But in any event, so the pasuk tells us that over here to count the Jewish people, but it's done in an indirect way. The way the counting was done was that each person gave. It's also interesting, the pasuk calls it a kofer nefesh. Understand literally an atonement for your soul. What does that mean? Why is it like that? But each person would give the half shekel, and the half shekels would then be counted. And you know how many half shekels there were, how many people gave them. You know how many people there are. And the pasuk says, there shouldn't be a plague. There shouldn't be an affliction when you come and count the people. We know later on in Tanakh, and the Gemara references this point as well, when David HaMelech counted the people and he took a census, and that was, again, different explanations in the Mefarshim exactly. Was it the fact that he counted them at all? Was it the way that he counted them? But and many thousands died as a result. So that is something to be avoided. So the question is, why is it so bad? What is the big problem with counting people, counting the Jewish people? So the Mefarshim give a few different answers. Many of them are more or less variations on the same theme. The Rashi says that we're worried here. There's a concern of Ayin Hara. When you come along and you count the people directly, and you count each one, you call attention, as it were, to each individual within them. We're worried that will cause an Ayin Hara, and that will cause bad things to happen. And other Mefarshim explain a little bit more in depth. Rabbeinu Bachaya says the following. He says, essentially, we know that there is power to the klal. There is power. We find many different expressions of this, many times in halacha, many times in Torah, that the idea of rabbim, for example, when it comes to tefillah, you cannot compare the tefillah of an individual to the tefillah of rabbim, the tefillah of the tzibur. The tzibur is a whole, is a collective that is far greater than the sum of its parts. So says Rabbeinu Bachaya, he says, if you start counting people, what happens? Essentially, you're counting, you get to the number at the end, but as you go through and as you count each individual. And what's the problem? He says, like this. He says, Shiur HaKatuv ken v'natnu es kofer nafsho l'Hashem bimnot otam kedei shelo yeh b'hem negef b'shkicho otam. They have to give this kofer nefesh so that there won't be this negef with the hashkacha when he counts, when he watches over them. What does that mean? He says, Gira lacha HaKatuv ki am hanifrat b'minyano kol echad legulgolotam. When you come now to count the nation and you count them one by one by each individual, counting the people directly, essentially, he says, essentially, when you go through and you count each individual, you're calling out each individual, you're calling out the hashkacha, the divine supervision, to look at each individual and examine their deeds. That's not something we necessarily want to call attention to. When we're part of the whole, we're part of the collective. Okay, that's fine. But you start going through and you start looking at the individuals, and each individual has their problems, and has chataim, and has things that they've done. So he says, at the beginning, it was just one part of the great nation. The nation's wonderful. The collective is the tzibur. You're going to go through one by one. It can't be that you're going to find everybody's going to be immaculate, everybody's going to be perfect, and therefore you're calling out that attention, so to speak, and that is the disadvantage. That's how Rabbeinu Bachaya says. Seforno takes as an interesting twist on this. Again, a similar theme, but he says the point is that when you count, so you are, he says the problem is, the words he uses, he says, mitzad ha'ishtanut, ha'koreh b'yishav me'havayav efted. It's the change that happens. You look at the census, you look at the counting how many people are here. You think about how many people you counted last time. You think about who's still here and who's not here anymore. You think about the past and you think about the present, and you think that there are certain individuals who were here or are no longer, and those who are here, it's questioned. Why am I still here? Do I still deserve to be here? It's a different angle, but it's that hashgacha coming and calling attention to each individual, so to speak. I saw a piece by the late Rabbi Sachs, from a number of years ago, where he goes in a slightly different direction as well. And he says like this. He says, the problem with counting, he says, why do you count? Why do you go count a nation? Why do you take a census? Essentially, you can sum it up as strength in numbers. Right? The more you have, the better it is. When you go and you count, you want to know, you count for military reasons, you count for economic reasons, you count for political reasons. Right? We just had the elections yesterday. What do? You count the strength in numbers. The more people that came and voted for you, however many notes you have in the ballot box, so that's how much representation you have. That's how much power you have. The greater the numbers, the greater it is. That's generally that's the message behind counting. Why is it such a terrible thing to go and count the Jewish people? Because that's not how we work. We don't work based on numbers. If we're just talking about strength in numbers, so then we're doomed to fail. We've always been small. We always will be small. The Torah tells us that. It promises us that. But there is something more. In absolute terms, the numbers may be less. Rabbi Sachs has a sentence. He says, if you want to count the Jewish people, he says the way you do it is you ask them to give. You ask them to give, and then you count their contribution. That's the way you do it. And that's what we do. We give them the money. We give them the machatzit shekel. We count how much we have. You don't count the people. You don't count the individuals. This nation has more. That nation has more. The world has more. That's fine. We're not worried about that. But look at what we do. Look at what we give. Look at what we're able to contribute. You look at what's going on over now. What's happening now. So we are something like 0.2% of the world's population. If you didn't know, if you look at the news, you look at how much attention gets given to Israel versus all the other conflicts and wars and genocides that are taking place in the world. So you would think that the Jewish people make up at least 50% of the world's population, at least, right? And it's less than 0.5%. It's nothing in terms of numbers. And that's why if we play the numbers game, if we try and play the numbers game, you look at the people that are involved right now in Hasbara side of things, the spokesman's offices and on social media and things like that. I saw a graph earlier in the war. It was comparing the number of posts online on social media that were pro-Israel and the number of posts that appeared that were pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian, etc. You can't compare. It's off the charts. Why? Because look at how many people we are. And look at how many people they are. And you can trying to put these narratives forward all day, but we don't have that strength in numbers. We never have. But that's not the problem. That's meaning for those who are involved, who are trying to work in that arena, it is a problem. But that's not where we fight the battle. That's what the Torah is telling us over here. You may not have the numbers, but your contribution and your value and the way that what you can bring to the world in terms of that narrative, in terms of truth, in terms of justice, in terms of morals, in terms of technological innovation, whatever it is. Look at the number of Nobel Prizes we've won. It's far, far greater than the number we are. So if we focus on the numbers, you try and count the people, that is doomed to fail. So he says, don't count the people, but count what they bring, count what we give, count who we are, what we can achieve in the world. And that is something very different. And as a proof of this, there's a pasuk in a number of psukim, a passage in Tanakh, which maybe expresses this idea in Sefer Shoftim, the story of Gidon. Gidon, the Shofet who goes to fight against Midian. And over there, so the Tanakh tells us that Hashem comes and tells Gidon, he has an army at the beginning of 32,000 fighters. Okay, we don't learn military tactics from here, but this is the way that it was done, and there's obviously an underlying method. So there were 32,000 fighters. And Hashem says to Gidon, he says, you've got too many. Your army's too big. Not what the generals say nowadays, right? But he said, your army's too big. Why? You're going to think that it's all on you. you won't understand that it's coming for that Hashem is there, is with you, is miraculously going to save you. So he says you have to cut it down. So he says, go back and tell them that anybody who's scared, anybody who wants to go home should leave. And most of them leave, left with an army of 10,000 fighters. Hashem says, that's still too big. It's still too many. So go back. So he has a whole siman, and it's a fascinating story in Tanakh. You can go and look it up. He tells them to come and to go to drink by the water, depending on how they drink. Those who go down to the water, those who bring the water up to them. Eventually, he's left with 300 fighters from an army of 32,000 down to 300. Nowadays it's the opposite. Nowadays, and again, this is the way that it's meant to be. There was at the beginning of the war, they called up for Miluim. There was something far greater than 100% rate of soldiers who came to fight. But in any event, what's the message behind it? Again, the Tanakh is not Sefer Shoftim, it's not teaching us the military tactics, but it's teaching us the idea behind it. And the idea behind it is we don't count ourselves in terms of absolute how many individuals there are, but the contribution and the amirah and the vision and the message that the Jewish people brings to the world is far, far greater than what it is. We may not count ourselves, but we certainly can be counted. Rabbi Kenigsberg ben Akash Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu Zakot Yisrael Lefichach Ba'alem Torah Mitzvot Nema Adonai Chvetz Man Tzidko Yagdil Torah V'Yadin.